3 million people starved to death in Bengal in 1943, and the warehouses were full. Not empty, full. Rice was sitting in colonial stockpiles while mothers in Calcutta were boiling grass to feed children, whose ribs you could count through their skin. This wasn't a drought, it wasn't a plague, it wasn't a failed harvest. The crop that year was only slightly down from normal, and Bengal had survived worse without losing a fraction of those lives. So how do 3 million human beings vanish into mass graves in a single year in a province that was still growing food? The answer is the part the British Empire spent decades trying to keep you from finding. And when you hear it, you'll understand why. In the middle of World War II, Winston Churchill's war cabinet made a choice. They needed rice, not for the starving villagers of Bengal who actually grew it. They needed it for European stockpiles, for soldiers, for a strategic reserve in case the war dragged on and Britain needed to feed Greeks and Yugoslavs and its own troops far from home. So they took it. Ship after ship sailing out of Indian ports loaded with the food of people who were already going hungry. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Australia offered grain. Canada offered grain. The United States offered grain. Churchill's government turned them down. While bodies piled up in the streets of Calcutta so thick that municipal workers couldn't keep pace with the corpses. You were taught Churchill saved the free world. Nobody mentioned the 3 million he let die to balance a wartime ledger. For decades, this story was buried, not just forgotten, buried. The cabinet papers were classified. The official narrative blamed the weather, blamed a cyclone, blamed Japanese advances in Burma, cutting off Burmese rice imports. Anything but the policy, anything but the men in the room. Then the documents started coming out, and an economist named Amartya Sen, who had lived through the famine as a 9-year-old boy in Bengal, grew up and tore the official story apart with mathematics. He won a Nobel Prize partly for what he proved about that year. Famines, he showed, are almost never about a lack of food. They are about a lack of access to food. Bengal in 1943 had food. The food was being moved, hoarded, priced into the stratosphere, and shipped overseas while the people who grew it died beside the fields. If this is already rewiring how you see that war, hit subscribe, because what comes next is worse. Let's talk about who actually died, because the empire wanted you to picture vague, anonymous peasants. The reality was specific. Landless laborers, fishermen whose boats had been confiscated under a policy called denial, which seized vessels along the Bengal coast so the Japanese couldn't use them if they invaded. Except the Japanese never invaded. The boats just rotted, and the fishermen with no way to work starved first. They were the first wave. Then came the rural artisans, the weavers, the barbers, the potters, people whose entire economy depended on villagers having a few extra coins to spend. When the price of rice quadrupled in a matter of months, those coins vanished, and so did the artisans, then the small farmers, then the agricultural workers, then the women and the children, always the women and the children, walking into Calcutta in the desperate hope that the city would have something the countryside no longer did. It didn't. They died on the pavement. British soldiers stepped over them on their way to dinner. There are photographs, you can find them, children with the hollow stare of skulls, a woman lying on a street with a baby, still trying to nurse from a body that had nothing left to give. These were not images from a distant century. This was 1943, the same year as D-Day preparations, the same year your grandparents were buying war bonds and listening to fireside chats. And the food kept moving, out of Bengal, onto ships, across oceans, to stockpiles that in many cases were never even used. Churchill's own words from that period have survived. When officials in Delhi cabled London begging for food aid, Churchill reportedly responded by asking why, if the shortage was so terrible, Gandhi hadn't died yet. He blamed Indians for breeding like rabbits. He told his Secretary of State for India that he hated Indians, that they were a beastly people with a beastly religion. These are not interpretations. These are recorded quotes in the diaries of the men sitting across the table from him. This was the man making decisions about whether food would reach a starving Bengali child. And he made those decisions exactly the way you would expect a man who said those things to make them. Here's something else they don't put in the textbooks. The famine wasn't only a failure of mercy, it was a transfer. Wealth moved, land moved. When small farmers couldn't pay debts, moneylenders took their fields. When women had nothing left, they were trafficked. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Bengali women and girls were sold into prostitution during and immediately after the famine, because their families had nothing else to sell. The famine restructured Bengali society. It hollowed out a class, it enriched a few, and it did all of this under the supervision of an empire that called itself civilized. Now you might be asking, why didn't anyone in Britain stop it? The answer is that some tried. Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, repeatedly begged the cabinet to send food. He compared Churchill's attitude to Hitler's in writing, in his own diary. The Viceroy of India, Lord Wavell, called the famine one of the greatest disasters that has befallen any people under British rule, and noted with disgust that the response from London was indifference bordering on hostility. These weren't Indian nationalists, these were the empire's own men, and they were horrified. It didn't matter. The shipments continued. The aid offers were refused. The famine ran its course because the people who could have stopped it chose not to. And after the war, after the bodies were buried and the photographs filed away, the story was simply not told. British school children grew up on Churchill the bulldog, Churchill the savior, Churchill the voice of freedom. Indian school children learned about the famine but were told it was complicated, weather-related, wartime chaos. The specific cabinet decisions, the specific ships, the specific refusals, those stayed in locked archives for 50 years. If you've made it this far and you're feeling something hot in your chest, give the video a like. It genuinely helps these stories reach people who were never told. When the documents finally came out, when Amartya Sen and historians like Madhusri Mukherjee laid the evidence on the table, the reaction in Britain was mostly silence. A few op-eds, a few uncomfortable academic debates, no apology, no memorial, no reckoning. The statues of Churchill still stand. The face is still on the £5 note. 3 million ghosts, and not one of them gets so much as a plaque in the country that killed them. Think about what that means. Think about how much of history you were handed as fact is actually just the version that won. The version that controlled the printing presses and the school curriculums and the films and the medals. Bengal 1943 is not an obscure footnote. It is one of the largest mass deaths of the 20th century. It is comparable in scale to events we treat as defining horrors of the modern age, and most people you'll ever meet have never heard of it. That's not an accident. That's a curriculum. Here's the part that lingers, if you let it. The grain that left Bengal that year, much of it sat in warehouses. Some of it spoiled, some of it was never needed. The calculation that killed those 3 million people wasn't even a calculation that worked. It was a hedge, a maybe, a just in case. Lives weighed against a contingency, and the contingency won. So the next time someone tells you the British Empire was, on balance, a civilizing force, you can tell them about a 9-year-old boy in Bengal who watched his neighbors die and grew up to prove, with numbers and Nobel-grade rigor, that the empire he lived under had blood on its ledger that no metal could ever wash off. 3 million people, full warehouses, refused aid, and a prime minister who asked why Gandhi was still breathing. History didn't forget Bengal. History was told not to remember. And now you do. If this changed something in you, hit like and subscribe, because there are more buried stories where this one came from, and somebody has to keep digging them up.